Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's National Carers Week webinar on starting the future planning process with the person you care for. I can see from our registration forms that we have mainly carers with us tonight, which is fantastic. And I know numbers are a little small. We have equal panelists and attendees at the moment. And I know it could be a difficult time of day for carers, but we just wanted to ensure that we had something available to people outside of standard office hours, because we do get that request occasionally, and we will be recording for those that weren't able to make it. I hope everybody is managing their connections okay in the storm. I know some of our team had some issues in the last hour with damage, so hopefully everyone's doing okay. My name is Sarah Judd-Lamb, and I'm the Executive Manager Policy Research and Projects at Carers for South Wales. And I'm joined tonight by a number of distinguished colleagues that you can see and who I'll introduce shortly. If we can go to the next slide, please, Melissa. Before we get started, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we are dialing in from tonight. Where I am, it's in Epping, and that's the Wallamedigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to extend my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and to also the traditional custodians of the lands represented here tonight by our attendees and panellists, and to any First Nations carers that are joining us. Next slide, please, Melissa. The focus of tonight's webinar is on supporting carers to plan for the future with the person they care for, where that person in particular has a cognitive impairment or experiences impaired decision-making ability. And there are a number of different disabilities or conditions where a person may experience permanent or episodic impairment in their decision-making, including, for example, mental illness, autism, intellectual disability, dementia, a neurological condition, for example, following a stroke, a terminal or serious illness, or even a drug or alcohol dependency. And so all of those categories fall into our definition of carers, which is very broad. And we're speaking tonight about how family and friend carers of people with those conditions can tackle the sometimes challenging questions of how to work with that person to plan for the future. When we talk about future planning, we're talking about all kinds of conversations and decisions around different aspects of life, both now and in the future, relating to finances, accommodation, healthcare, and end-of-life preferences, among other areas. And the purpose of future planning with the person you care for is to ensure that their values and wishes are upheld, including in circumstances where they may find it difficult to communicate their preferences. It's ideal to start the future planning process early and to involve everyone that might be affected by the decisions at hand. And really, we see decisions and future planning and decision-making around the carer and the person that they care for to really affect both. And that, they might have the same preferences or plans, they might have different preferences or plans. It's really important to work together as much as possible. And we know that these conversations can be confronting and also practically difficult, especially when you're caring for someone with a cognitive impairment. And that's why we've got this topic tonight, and that's why we've been working closely with the experts that I'm going to introduce you to shortly, if they don't mind me calling them experts. We also know Carers New South Wales does a lot of research and consultation with carers, and we know from our research that a lot of carers are very involved in the planning, administration, support coordination and decision-making support of the person they care for, especially where they're caring for someone with a cognitive impairment. And we also know that this can be very time-consuming and stressful and demanding for carers. And most carers really do just want the best for the person they care for, but a lot of carers feel overwhelmed about these kinds of tasks, and they're not sure about how to make that happen or how to go about conversations about the future. Next slide, please, Melissa. So to help guide us through some of these considerations, and we don't expect to solve all these issues in 1 hour tonight, we're going to hear briefly from the following people, and it's a pretty packed agenda. So we're going to race through and touch on some practical points as a starting point, hopefully for those of you that are watching, and hopefully it'll give you some direction as to next steps where you might be able to find some more information. And hopefully, if we all stick to time, myself included, we will have some time for questions towards the end of the webinar. So as Maddie has put in the chat, if you have questions that arise through the presentations, if you could just put those in the chat or use the question and answer function that you can see at the bottom of your page, and we'll do our best to get to those and put them to the panel towards the end of the webinar. So without much further ado, we're going to start off first of all by briefly introducing each of the organisations that are represented tonight. They're going to introduce themselves, give a few sort of key points, and then we'll go into some key topics where they'll share some of their advice and experience with you. So I would first like to introduce Rebecca Creed from Excitu, who's going to introduce herself.
Rebecca Glover and April Creed from Excitu, that's okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. We get mixed up all the time. So yeah, so I'm Rebecca Glover and I'm one of the co-founders of Excitu, and April is also here on the call with us tonight to answer any questions. And we have a background in aged care, but also have been a carer in my personal life. So really understand the challenges and the privilege that comes with caring for people. And we really are passionate about helping people to express their will and preference and what's really important to them. And back in 2017, we started to look at how we can really express people right throughout the process, from a personal lens, but also a professional lens in the aged care sector, to say, how can we support people to express what truly matters to them, knowing that often at times people can be really overwhelmed with complex information, and that people who are dealing with people who need care are very busy. So like we needed to find a really well thought out process to help people explore what matters to them and help people communicate and express their will and preference. So we founded Excitu, which is a company that uses technology to support people to express their values. And it utilises card sorting. So it works a bit like on an iPad, you drag around a bunch of cards to really get you thinking about what's important. And then it gets people to communicate in their own words what they want and what's important to them. And it translates the information into things that are clinically and legally relevant to help people plan for the future. And the reason that we focused on values is because we realised that in the journey of caring for a person, there are so many decisions that need to be made that can be really difficult to make. And you'll never be able to ask somebody in advance every single thing that they would want under certain circumstances. But the commonality between all of it is that values are really the foundations of decision making. So that's what we really focused on when we built Excitu and what we're really passionate about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca, and apologies for getting your surname wrong. I don't know how I read that incorrectly off the slide. So next, I'm introducing Michael Perkins and Jane Loney from Autonomy First.
So Jane, do you want to go first?
I'll go. Yep, absolutely. Hello to everyone, and thanks very much for joining and tuning in to listen this evening. I'm Jane Loney, and I'm a clinical neuropsychologist by background, which means a lot of people haven't necessarily come across many of us before. But essentially, I've spent the last sort of 23 or so years, I suppose, helping to manage patients and individuals who have changes in cognition because of brain changes, and helping families as well, I suppose, to manage symptoms to ensure that the patient has the best quality of life moving forward. Because my focus has always been on older adults, I have had a lot of, I suppose, experience in the area of dementia specifically, and that in turn, I suppose, dragged me into the world that is capacity and legal capacity. And that's in that context, that's where I teamed up with Michael Perkins. And we are co-founders of a clinic at MQ Health known as the Capacity and Capability Clinic. And through that clinic, our aim has been to bring a blended medical and legal approach to issues around decision-making capacity, in the hope that we achieve a better outcome for the individual at the centre of the decision-making and their family, and in the hope that the decision that's made is truly reflective of that individual's will and preference.
Thanks, Jane. So I'm the other half of Autonomy First. So as she said, Jane and I founded Autonomy First the beginning of last year, we hold the contract to operate the clinic at Macquarie Health, but we also operate a blended medico-legal professional firm, which is Autonomy First, that has an internal law firm in it. So the firm contains the multidisciplinary service. From my perspective as a lawyer, I've teamed up with Jane because between us, we saw that there were misconceptions about not only capacity, which as almost an article of faith has to be seen as a relative, not a binary concept. So capacity is not something that you have or have not. It's what you do with the capacity you have. So our focus is on supporting decision-making. So supported decision-making is not just about legislation, it's about the practicalities of keeping the person under care in the center of the decision-making process. It's a matter of practice and process, not legislation and law. We also come across a lot of misconceptions about the role and purpose of a person's appointment as an attorney or guardian or person responsible, and how far they can go with formal and informal decision-making supports. So we wrap all of this up in a focus around what we're calling a state administration that's got a planning and succession focus. And that's where we've also started work with Excitu. So that very briefly is our focus, and we look forward to the discussion this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane and Michael. And lucky last, Fiona Tate from Relationships Australia, New South Wales, over to you. Oh, I think you are muted, Fiona.
That's a brilliant start. Thanks, Sarah. I'm a bit freaked out by all the rain at the moment. Anyway, I'd like to say hi to everyone. My name's Fiona, and I'm one of the elder mediators with Relationships Australia's Let's Talk Elder Mediation and Support Service. And I guess my part in the panel today is to talk to you more about the relational issues facing those who provide support, care, and love to a spouse or a family member or a friend. I'm also here to discuss how the relationships between carers and care recipients can be best supported, especially when there's difficulty or conflict. So the focus of our service is really to support older people, their families and carers, providing mediation, counselling and referrals. And often cases involve family members who've taken on caring roles as a result of the gradual process of ageing or sudden health incidents, accidents or impairments of a family member. And when we age, sometimes the effect of disability and frailty can mean a change in our status from caregiver to care receiver. And such changes can affect individual personal relationships and family dynamics, and also the way we see ourselves and how others see us. Much of our work centres around supporting the independence, preference, and choice of older people who become incapacitated in some way. So we've tried to provide safe and confidential spaces for people to discuss their concerns. And we'll talk about those later, but they include things like future planning and changing needs. And we support when we work with the family, the needs of everybody and all participants, and understand the interconnected nature of those receiving care and also those providing care, and the importance to understand and acknowledge both with any sort of support we offer. We assist older people who care for each other and older people caring and supporting adult children and grandchildren, and obviously vice versa. And we work in a therapeutic wellness model that promotes a person-centered approach towards all participants. And ours is important, I suppose, in thinking about what we do. Our process is not a legal process. We work with people who really need to think about what works for them in their circumstances now, and also to factor in change, because sometimes things can change as you move forward. The main thing, I guess, is that we focus on the rights, needs and voices of older people or those who are cared for, to make sure that they're heard, respected and included in any decisions that impact them. but we also appreciate the incredible support that families and carers provide willingly and freely. And when addressing issues of concern and future planning for those receiving care, we really want to ensure that everybody involved is considered, their needs are considered, acknowledged and supported. So it's really, I'm really here to talk about that, work through a case study, talk about where to go for support and how to deal with changes you might need to make as you move forward. And so for this reason, I'm really pleased to be here and being part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. So as everyone can see, I'm sure we have a really interesting range of panelists tonight, and they have a lot of information to offer, but we're going to probably just skim the surface tonight. So Carers New South Wales has been working with each of these organisations for some time now, looking at really improving information and support available to carers in this tricky area. And I think we've been learning a lot from each other as well. So what I asked them to do was to distill sort of some key points in this area that could help us give some practical tips to those of you that are joining us tonight. So we're going to go briefly over 3 key topics, and what we'll do is one organisation will lead each, and then others will add as needed. So it's a bit ambitious, and I'm hoping it will go well, and we'll stick to time. But starting off first, the first topic is, how can I support my loved one's wishes now and in the future? And Melissa, if you could just go to that slide. So I think Rebecca is going to kick us off on this topic, and then others can add any key points that come through. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and I'm going to start it off with a little bit of a quick story. And it's actually, I decided that the best one to start with is a personal one. I mentioned in my introduction that I was a carer in my personal life as well. And I think that that story is really relevant to the topic tonight about planning ahead and understanding values. So what happened is my husband's grandmother, we became carers for her because my husband didn't actually know his grandmother growing up. And so the kind of relationship he had with her was to, he met her later in life, and we used to call in to maybe mow her lawns and check in on her once every 2 or 3 weeks. And as she started to get older, she sort of had thought about what she might need. And she sat us down one day and asked us to be her persons responsible if something was to happen to us. So we said, yeah, that's totally fine. And I remember thinking, I worked in aged care at the time, I remember thinking that it was really important to me that if I was to be her carer, that I made sure that I empowered her to live the life she wanted to live and make choices on her own and those kind of things. But what actually happened was, over time, as her needs got higher and higher, I hadn't recognised that her cognitive skills were starting to break down. She was getting early onset dementia. And we hadn't really had some of the really important discussions about what she might want if certain things had happened, which meant that when it came time and her needs were higher and she had to have higher levels of home care support and eventually move into residential aged care, there were a lot of things that unfolded that in hindsight could have been a lot less stressful if we had had some conversations earlier on. So it's really, what I really took away from that and learnt from that is, one practical thing to do, if at all possible, is really to sit down and have meaningful conversations about planning for the future. And it's why I'm really happy to be in this webinar tonight and speaking about it. And I mentioned that we focus on values very much because you can't always know what a person might want now and in the future. But really, through having some meaningful and deep conversations about a whole range of things, from, you know, what brings joy to a person, how somebody feels about pets, what it is about home that makes home feel like home. There's all kinds of conversations that can be had that can be really soft and focused on values and who a person is as an individual, but can then lead into some of the conversations that are traditionally seen as more tricky conversations about things like moving into residential aged care and if that was needed, and also end of life conversations. So the 2 big things that we really want to focus on is having meaningful conversations about values, and also to making sure that you're planning ahead as much as possible and starting those conversations a lot earlier than what they needed, because they're much harder conversations to have if a person's already in crisis. And that leads into a lot of stress for the carer and for the person receiving care and for everybody around. does anybody want to add or have any questions to that bit there? Or
Jane and Michael, did you want to add any key points on that topic of supporting a loved one's wishes now and in the future?
Michael, I think you're on mute.
Look, from my point of view, the carers and this early stage conversation is really like the canaries in the mine. If someone can't express their will and preference about these deeply personal issues, maybe that's a flag for that there is a decision-making problem then and there. And so from my point of view, understanding your wishes and the ability to express it is the foundation for being able to deal with more complex issues and more sensitive issues later. So I see this as being an absolutely invaluable foundation point, but from which we can then move on, and I'll come on and speak to that in the next section.
Thanks, Michael. That's a really good point. And I think one of the things that we like to focus on with talking about values as well kind of talks to Michael's point earlier about capacity not being a black or white issue. Because somebody can have the ability to speak about their values in various formats, and they can go into great detail about some things. But one of the things, the conversations we have quite a lot is because we have two aspects to the way that we approach future planning. One is a very detailed conversation about a whole range of values, about things, as I mentioned, like, you know, staying at home and all those kind of things. And the other is the advanced care planning process. So the advanced care planning process goes on and asks people questions about the sort of medical interventions that they might want or not want if something happens to them. Things like, do you want resuscitation? Would you like to be transferred to hospital? And some of those conversations, it can be a bit tricky. And we often get asked by people who are caring for others and say, you know, this person might have a diagnosis of early onset dementia. Are they capable of filling out an advanced care planning document? And what we always say to people, and there's a whole range of answers to that question, but one thing we always really encourage people to do is, even if somebody doesn't have the capacity, say, to sign their advanced care directive, it doesn't mean that it's not worth having the conversation about their values, because people can tell us a lot about their values. And often when you sit down with people and have that conversation, even with people who have quite advanced stages of dementia, you'd be surprised at the insights that you can get when you sit down and take the time to really listen and really have that deep conversation about what's important to a person now and what's important to a person in the future.
And I would just add there, the way that I sort of conceptualize it, and yes, I agree entirely with the point Rebecca's making, is that you know, at a conceptual level, really, and at a starting point, we're dealing, I suppose, with two separate entities, one being the will and preference of the person that Rebecca has just illustrated and spoken about, and the second being the decision-making capacity or the legal capacity of the person. So, and I'll touch on this a bit later, but, you know, they very much sit side by side, and they're both very important elements of ensuring that ultimately whatever occurs is in line with what the person wanted. And but I think really important as well to understand that they are very separate entities, and the ability to express will and preference often persists long after there is the loss of you know, what's termed legal capacity or decision-making capacity. So yes, they sit side by side, both very important, but both very separate things that we need to ascertain and work with.
Yeah. And I think
sorry, Michael.
Sorry, and I don't want to steal from our next session, but I think it's really important that we don't confuse the ability to express an opinion from the ability to make a decision. I think that needs to be kept as a stark difference and it's very important, and that's something that we'll explain further later.
Fiona, do you want to add something?
I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's, as Rebecca's explaining, that those ideas of those deeper conversations, Michael and Jane, is so useful, because quite often, I think especially within families, there's an assumption that we know, because we know the person so well, we know what they want, we know what they wanted, we know what they like, and we also assume that everybody knows what we want, but unless we actually make it very clear, it's surprising how little people do actually know about the wishes of others, especially those close to them. And so that's when it can become very difficult and conflictual, when people have very different ideas of what someone who may be no longer able to articulate their wishes clearly, other people will step in and say, I think I know. And somebody will say, well, I think I know. So I think it's really important to think about and do it as early as you can.
I agree, Fiona. And I just want to quickly add, sometimes too, by having these conversations, you can identify some really quick and easy wins. So there's been cases where, by having not just to ask one question that can be given a one-word answer, but really having a meaningful, engaging and listening conversation where you're both trying to understand what it is that a person wants, and how you can have really honest conversations about what is possible, what isn't possible, what your own limitations are as a carer as well. And things that are just like a very quick example of conversations that have come about with things like that is a person who wanted to stay at home and family members who were looking at putting them into residential aged care. And because of having a really detailed discussions about sounds around them and joys and things like that, it came to light that this person actually just really wanted to listen to their music loudly. And by getting a set of Bluetooth headphones, it could solve a lot of the problems that were at the heart of what was causing this family conflict. So it's really important to have a conversation, but take the time to really have a meaningful conversation and really listen to each other's needs.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. And I'm assuming we're ready to move on to our second topic now. Fantastic. So thank you, Rebecca, especially for leading that conversation. Our next of the three sort of big topics we want to talk about, and I think I can see the slides up there, is what is my role and when does it start? And so we're going to have Autonomy First leading this one and others adding in. So over to you, Autonomy First.
Jane, do you want to start?
Yep, happy to start. Absolutely. I'm going to, with the short amount of time I have, I'm going to really approach this at a very sort of conceptual level. And I think really as a carer in supporting somebody with the planning process for the future, there's, I suppose, a number of core jobs that we have, or things that we really need to be looking to achieve. And I think the first of these is really we need to be attempting to elicit and facilitating some communication about what will be important decisions that are going to have to be made about somebody's future. I think, as I say, as a carer, particularly when we're dealing with individuals where there has been cognitive change, really one of the things that we can do is provide the support, I suppose, to facilitate and to start that level of communication rather than relying on somebody else to pick that up and initiate things. I think, we really need to help the individual explore the range of possibilities that are available to them. And as Rebecca's already very clearly illustrated, we have a really important role in facilitating the expression of the individual's will and preferences around those important decisions. I suppose one of the things that I become, one of the areas that I become involved in because of my background in neuropsychology is the job of, I suppose, ascertaining what aspects of decision-making and planning that the person that you are caring for can and in some cases is no longer able to contribute to in a meaningful and competent manner. So, yeah, obviously the starting point is to assume that the individual we're caring for is competent to engage on all levels. But as I say, where there are changes in the brain, unfortunately, invariably there are parts of a decision, particularly when it's complex, that may be problematic for that person to grasp and to be involved in. So I think we really, and in my opinion, carers are the experts in this area. They know the individual better than anybody else, and they're very well placed to determine, I suppose, what levels that the person is able to make a contribution on, and where the difficulties lie. But it's really important that we pay attention to that. And the reason it's important that we do pay attention to that is because the next task really, and the whole point, is that really what we're trying to do is to bring the decisions within the mental scope of the person that we're caring for. And we have to be able to do that if we're going to maximise their ability to contribute to planning around their own future. So part of that is understanding what the individual can and cannot bring to the table in terms of engaging in the decision-making process. And part of that is, acknowledging when aspects of decision-making, particularly if it's a complex decision, are beyond the scope of the person. And I touched on this a little bit earlier on. In the process of doing that, and in the process of caring for somebody, it's really important that we avoid conflating expression of will and preference or choice with competent decision-making ability. And that's by no means pointed towards carers directly, because in the practical reality is that's a problem that we see very, very commonly in the medical profession, in the legal profession. There's this real difficulty, I suppose, in disentangling those two areas. I'm just going to say a couple of things, and I'll pass over to Michael, about when our role starts. And I think that we can really think about this issue in two ways. I think we can think about, well, when do we start getting involved in a legal sense? And I think Michael's going to touch on that in a moment a bit more. But we can also think about it simply within the context of the relationship that we have with the person that we're caring for. And I think most of us would agree that open communication is really part of any healthy relationship. And most of us, I think it's fair to say, would prefer to share and have somebody to bounce ideas off around important decisions and plans for our future, as opposed to making those decisions on our own. And a really key point here is the earlier that we engage in discussions around planning for our future, the reality is the better we're likely to be equipped to partake in and contribute to those discussions. And that's particularly the case when we are dealing with conditions wherein the brain changes are continuing to progress over time. So it becomes progressively more difficult to engage in that planning and decision-making process. In a legal sense, the flip side, and Michael's going to talk about this a bit more, really our role as to when we step in is partly determined by the nature and the complexity of the decision and the planning that is occurring. And of course, there are different sets of legal criteria for different forms of legally binding decisions, whether we're thinking about things like making a will or appointing an enduring power of attorney, or deciding what kind of and level of support we might like, or where we might like to live in the future. I'll just leave you with, I suppose, what I see as a really important point to grasp. And that is the whole concept that more often than not, there is, and Michael's touched on this, there's no absolute loss of decision-making capability in a person that we're caring for. And because of that, the first line of approach really should be one of supporting the decision-making abilities of the person under care, as opposed to making or taking away the decision and making the decision on their behalf where it's possible. And I'm just going to point out now, because that may sound frustrating to some people, who obviously have been in a position where they've done everything possible to promote the will and preference of the person they're caring for and support their decision. So what I should add is that there are unfortunately cases, particularly where the person that we're caring for no longer has insight into the nature of their difficulties. What I mean by that is there are situations where the brain changes, and I suppose it robs an individual of an awareness of their limitations. And I think that it should be acknowledged that in those situations, the whole concept of support and supported decision-making can be particularly challenging.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I'm going to try and take a practical, very quick sort of skim over a number of what I think are key legal issues. One is that you do not need a document in order to necessarily have legal obligations towards someone. If you're in the Australian Capital Territory, we now have elder abuse being a criminal activity. So whether or not some conduct amounts to abuse can have legal ramifications then and there. If you're in, say, New South Wales, where under the Guardianship Act, it can be a person responsible and have medical decision-making rights simply by being involved in that person's care and welfare, then you attract legal responsibility and legal rights by the nature of the caring process itself. So when we're looking at saying, well, okay, where does your responsibility start? It starts when a person starts relying on you in any particular way. So a simple way to think of this is think of this like a diamond, or there are four poles that we need to be conscious of when we're looking at the implications of caring. One is short versus long. If you're only being relied on for a short period, then what you've got to do to complete the expectation of the person is relatively simple. And it's usual that the person you're caring for remains a supervisor or engaged to the tasks that you're doing. And if you wanted to describe that in one word, that might be that would be agent. You're the agent of the person that you're caring for, and you are accountable to them, and you've got that high quality of communication. But as people age, and this is irrespective of their ability, then the more they rely on people for longer and longer periods, the more certain they need that relationship to be. And that's where it's important to capture the demonstrated ability of the person as soon as possible, because one of the first things Jane taught me, what is now years ago, is that the first thing that goes in decision-making ability is insight, and the last thing that goes is language. So the most useful question when someone says, I want to do X, Y, and Z, the most useful second question inevitably is why? If the person can't explain the rationale and the objective that they want to achieve, you've got a problem there. And the challenge that we see continually through our clinical operations is people waiting too late to try and establish some form of high trust collaborative environment with the person under care. The basic rule is earlier the better. So early intervention is something that we need to be very conscious of. But the other thing, if you are tipped into a caring responsibility, is to ask, has this person made a power of attorney or guardianship or any other kind of formal arrangements about their care in the past? because there could be other people around with formal decision-making rights and you're being tipped into an informal situation. As a solicitor, as a private client lawyer for over 30 years, we find that things like powers of attorney and guardianship get set up pretty well automatically now with wills, so they can be existing in the bottom drawer of someone for decades before they have to be actioned. So around this idea of, well, where do we start, is the idea of, well, okay, how do we activate a power of attorney or power of guardianship? The simple reality is that if you're going to wait until the person's had a fall and is in the emergency room at the hospital, before you understand that you are the attorney and or guardian and you actually have some formal roles, it's often too late, because the trauma of the event reduces the ability of someone to participate. This question of participation also is vital when we're dealing with mental health issues, because mental health is not always remediable. A lot of the mental health care approaches are to bring someone back to normal function in the community, but not all mental health patients can come back to a complete or normal set of functioning. So one of the more difficult transitions we face is this boundary point between mental health and disability. And it's, as a society, I think we deal with that very badly. What I've learned in the last 2 years of working with Jane at the clinic is that we have to get down to the level of communication that the person under care can cope with. And that's where we start. And our vision is to continually work within the demonstrated decision-making ability of someone. So whether that's in my normal role as a lawyer or in my clinical role with Jane, that's the baseline that we apply. So with that, happy to open it up to questions and comments.
We may need to just move into the next section, but absolutely happy to take comments and questions maybe after we've finished that. And thank you so much for that, Michael, especially for bringing up the mental health side, because I know we've had a couple of comments in the chat about that. It's a really important distinction. So thank you everyone for that second section. And if we can go to the third slide, the third topic, Melissa, thank you. The third big topic that we're seeking to cover in a short space of time is around tension and disagreement. So I think Fiona from RA New South Wales is going to kick us off on this topic, and then others might add. And then once that one's done, we'll have some Q&A. So as people are speaking, again, feel free to pop some questions in the chat. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you. And I do apologise. I think in the flurry, I turned off my microphone, I turned off my camera. So it's lovely to see you. I think you may not have seen me at the beginning. Apologies for that. So yeah, looking at managing tension and disagreement, that's not an easy task straight away, because so often, oftentimes, as we said, everything is individual, and so there are lots of different things that can be going on, and it's often unraveling those. But as Beck and also Michael and Jane have said, having conversations early is really key, and talking to each other. We often have people who ring in to our service, and the first thing we ask them is, have you actually talked about this yourselves? And quite often they haven't, because there's a fear of conflict. There may be a fear of rocking the boat. And so sometimes people will reach out to other services and just need support sometimes, and encouragement that it's okay. These things are okay to talk about. You can go back if you feel comfortable. We can obviously help, so services can help, but if you can do it yourself, it's a really good thing to be able to do and to start doing that. If you are going to talk have these difficult conversations, which are conflicted, try to keep things friendly. Try to do it when it's not a time which is heightened or fraught. And try to stick to the facts, because we all get very emotional if we're upset about something. And if you can really, before you start to talk to somebody about an important issue, try to be factual, try to say what's actually happening and what you're actually experiencing. And it's the same when you ask someone questions about what they would like or what they prefer. It's good to be quite specific so they understand what you're asking them. Direct questions, not unkind questions, but just keeping things simple so that people can give you a straightforward answer. and trying to see the other person's point of view. And that means really trying to see the other person's point of view, imagining how it would be like for them. For example, imagining what it would be like to be giving care, or imagine what it would be like to be receiving care, and think about what that would mean for somebody. And also, because things can change, is their reaction to that care different now than it was 6 months ago? And is that important? And thinking about that hard. And sometimes when things really are conflicted and difficult, it's better to walk away and just say, could I have a little bit of time? Because I'm taking you seriously. I just want to consider what you've said. I just want to think about this. And maybe I need to get some information and come back to talk to you. So when we talk to people, we also need to get them to consider their own needs. Sometimes if people have been caring for someone for a long time, they've almost lost themselves in that care. The care can be exhausting, it can be perpetual, it's daily, and it's also that thing of not just physically caring, but it's also the preparation, the anticipation, the making of appointments, basically running everything. And often people have their own families to deal with, they have work problems, they have pressures, sometimes they have their own health problems, and these can all impact and make things much more stressful. So it's the old thing of you can't kind of pour from an empty cup. So it's really important for people to get support if they feel that they're caring and things are really becoming too difficult for them, to put their hand up and reach out for help, talk to family members and explain that you took on this role willingly and happily, but at the moment things are just too much. Sometimes people's needs increase, and they can increase quite quickly, and that can cause a huge amount of stress, especially if someone doesn't want to say, I can't do this anymore, or I can do some of this, but I can't do all of this. So it's really important to be able to talk to people. And if you can't talk to people close, to reach out to a service who can support you to come back in and have those conversations with, those you care for and those you're involved with. And also with family conflict, one thing we find, which seems like a strange thing, but there are different ideas of care. So quite often in families, we're dealing with family members who love the person who's being cared for, but they actually have different ideas of what care looks like. Some may have a completely medical and interventionist idea of what care looks like. And especially with older people, that might mean going to a lot of appointments, having a lot of scans, having a lot of assessments, having a lot of interventionist medical procedures, with an idea that this is keeping somebody well and keeping them alive. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you may have another member of the family who feels that what they want is for the person is quality of life. And that I know Dad needs all these things and he's getting very old, but he really just likes to tinker around in his shed. And he really just wants to touch things that he loves and to be close to things that, that remind him of Mum. And we're really happy for him to do that. And if he gets a cold or he hasn't had a flu jab, and so be it. He's really quite elderly now, and we just want him to be quiet and enjoy the last years or however long he's got. And that difference can cause quite a lot of conflict in families, because everybody believes that they're doing the best thing. So it's not that anybody's wrong, and certainly when we come together, it's not about judgment, but it's about trying to bring people together to say, well, what would your father want? And also, is there something that you can agree on? It's okay to disagree on a lot of things, but in terms of your father's care in this particular case, what do you think you can agree on? And once you focus in on the person, it makes it much easier, because of course there is a love and also there's a knowledge of that person. In terms of building confidence, what we would say is what has been said already, is get some information. If you don't know what you need to know, and you don't need to know everything, but it is really useful to be informed. It's useful to be informed about what the person you're caring for wants. And that doesn't mean just what they wanted when they were 30, but if they're now in their 90s, what do they want now? Because it may be quite different. and to actually talk to that person about what's important to them and what do they want moving forward. But also for yourself to have education, to understand what care provision looks like, to have a little bit of an understanding of the system, as Michael and Jane have said, to understand the legal documents, and as Beck said, to think about advanced care planning and working through all those things is really important to give you, so that you're empowered when you're having conversations with other people, other family members, about what you're talking about and what your options are and what the options are for the person you care for. To know who to go to for that support. And as I say, to consider, what is it like now for the person I'm caring for? And if anyone is going to challenge a carer, I think it's really important to understand what that is like. If you've been devoting your time and your energy and your love to looking after somebody, to really understand how to discuss the fact that you might want care to change, or you think care needs to be stepped up, or something needs to be done, to do it kindly and delicately, because otherwise people become very, very upset and also quite defensive, because they've been trying the very best usually that they can. So it's that understanding this is not easy. And often in a family, somebody will bear the burden of this. They will take it on themselves, or it will be given to them. And other family members may not understand that this person is struggling. So I think with that, I don't want to run out of time. I won't go to this case study, but that's really what I would say about those things, just to begin.
Thanks so much, Fiona. So just to make sure we do have some time for questions, are the panelists happy if we sort of wrap up the formal content there and open up to those that are attending today? Is that all right?
Yes, please.
Fantastic. So thank you so much to our panelists. Some really interesting and practical insights there, which hopefully have been useful. And I think we've seen through those discussions and through some of the questions coming through, people are really coming from diverse perspectives in terms of the conditions of the people they're caring for. And so I think it's been great that we've heard examples from different sort of situations. So what we will do now is, I think Maddie's going to help moderate questions. I can see we've had some questions and comments come through the chat and the Q&A. So I will start with a question that came through, and anyone on the panel is welcome to speak to this. The questioner said, you spoke about having those deeper conversations to understand a person's preferences. How do I do that? Is there a best way? How do I know where and when to have those conversations? Does anyone want to speak to that?
I'm happy to take that one if you want. I think that it's really important with deeper conversations, and when to have them. It's as soon as you can have them, and often, you know, if you can make some time to sit down and have it over a cup of tea in a nice environment, because I think that, as Fiona mentioned, people can get very defensive and it can be really difficult to have those deep questions. But it's really about being very curious about a person and what it is that they really value, and trying to see their side of the story. And so there are a range of different tools out there that you can use. I mean, ours uses card sorting. There are other card sorting. There are other people that have tools out there about having the conversation. But often you'll have things in mind that you might want to talk to somebody about. And I used the example of staying at home before. Don't just say, you know, how would you feel about moving into a nursing home or residential aged care, or I know that it's not just aged care, there's all kinds of care we might be talking about, but about, okay, well, what is it about home that really makes you want to stay at home? Focus on the positive things that you can talk to people about, and really getting curious about things, and really respecting your own emotional needs. Because I noticed in the chat there's somebody talking about not just dementia, but also mental illness and things like that. And I think a person's emotional capacity to cope with conversation, whether you're a carer or a person being cared for, is really important to recognise in how you approach a conversation as well.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Yes, and I've put this in the chat as well. You know, especially when we're dealing with people with intellectual disability, I find the most telling issue for me is to resolve what's the process by which they learn. Because inevitably, if I'm being called in, I'm asking them to take on board new knowledge. And if we're going to make no assumptions about capacity and no assumptions about ability, learning and their ability to learn is generally where I start. And the more the person can learn, the more they can take on board, and can they get over a formal threshold for a particular task or decision you can then come to. The other thing to consider compared to a fully functioning normal person, someone with a cognitive disability, irrespective of how it's caused, generally it takes between 30 and 50% more time to get a given job done. So you need to consider that in terms of the time you're making available to listen and work with this person, and give them the time to develop their own thinking and their own learning. Because we come across many situations where if that time is not given, then effectively the person under care is being shortchanged, and the result is you don't get the result that you're actually looking for, because they simply can't cope with the pace at which you're approaching the conversation. So slow down and communicate at the level of the person that you're trying to help.
I think that really speaks as well to sort of the supplementary question that we've had along these lines, which is, what if the person I care for can't engage in those conversations due to a profound disability? And so I guess, that is a challenging one. And it feeds into the next question that we got asked, which was, is there somewhere I can find information about future planning? As I guess the question, maybe if I can combine those and ask the panel, where that conversation is going to take more time and really take some skill to actually support that person to have the conversation, where can people go? Where do they start to get assistance with that?
I think there's a range. So sorry, Michael, go for it.
Oh no, I'm just saying that we all represent an entry point for help and service, depending on what the particular triggers are. But the Public Guardian website is actually a great place to start. Not necessarily TAG, but the Public Guardian site is very good. Sorry, Rebecca, go.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of resources, and it depends on the type of planning that you're wanting to do. And you mentioned a range of different abilities there for a person to plan, and I think that's relevant to the question as well. If you're talking about advanced care planning and the types of care that a person might want, then there's a range of Advanced Care Planning Australia. You can go to our website as well. I'm sure Relationships Australia and the other panelists, they all have different websites, and Carers Australia probably do as well. But it is very relevant to it, because if you're dealing with somebody that doesn't have a lot of ability to express themselves, regardless of the reason for that, then that might not be the suitable conversation and planning to be having, because even people who don't have the ability to express themselves in great detail might be able to make smaller decisions. So therefore, they might not need to necessarily do advanced care directives, but they might be able to make decisions in their day-to-day life. So the types of future planning that you would do with that person would vary depending on their ability to be able to express themselves.
Thanks for that. And the next question kind of touches on a similar topic, which is that the person I care for has a disability that affects their cognition, but they also can't verbally communicate. And so do you have any tips so that can ensure their voice is heard? And I guess in touching on what Michael said, I think we definitely recommend the Public Guardian and the Trustee and Guardian, and we will put some websites in the chat as well with these resources, because I know that they've worked on a lot of different projects around supported decision making in the context of disability. So I think it's probably something we can't solve right here, but it's something that Carers New South Wales is really passionate about better supporting carers to do in those tricky situations where, how do I get the person to communicate? And so I guess we'll put some links in the chat, but I think we're very happy to remain in touch as well, and we'll provide our email address at the end of the presentation to see if there is somewhere specific that has that expertise to point you to, because it is, I think, nonverbal is a really specific kind of niche in this area. But did anyone else want to add anything specific on that?
I mean, I think it's very, as Beck said, it's it depends quite a lot on how something has happened and where someone's at. So quite a lot of the people that, to be honest, that we're dealing with, they are older people, and they have had cognition and abilities, and those have been, for whatever reason, have declined or have been impaired or affected as they get older. So you have a bit of a history and a bit of an understanding within a family of what people might want, and some idea, and possibly even some documents from them, and some things that they've already said or written that tell you about future planning. In other situations, it's, yeah, as Michael said, the public trustee and guardian is a good place to start, but it's also having, I suppose, an understanding of that person yourself as their carer or as a family member, because you know them and you've been with them and you know what makes them happier and sadder and agitated or more comfortable, and working with those sorts of things.
And could I just throw in that in this discussion, this is where it really is important to be aware of this difference between substitute and supported decision making. So, and I'm sorry, Jane's had to drop off the call, because clinical neuropsychology is all about the link between brain, meaning, and expression. And so language is only one way of communicating. So if we focus on how does this person communicate, then work out, right, what are the strategies for us to listen so that we can get the message and work with them. So I don't see that verbal communication is any particular challenge in an absolute terms to carer representation and everything else that we're talking about. What we've got to be really careful about is, do we understand the process by which this person communicates, and do we communicate with them at that level?
That's a really good point, Michael. And again, something that I think as a peak organisation for carers, we've been really passionate about advocating for, because, there's lots of different ways in which someone may need assistance, but the technical skill involved in that is definitely a gap. And it's definitely something that we're working with different stakeholders, including the ones here today, to try and get some expertise and resources to really assist carers to do that, from people that do that for a living. And there are people that can, they have skills in that area as professionals. So it's something that we're working on doing more about. And Maddie is posting some links in the chat there that may be of assistance. And we'll also put, I think, our team's contact details there. So if you want to have an ongoing conversation. I'm aware it's 7:02 now. I'm happy to keep going with questions if people would like to stay on the line. And we are recording this, so we'll send the link around. Are people happy to continue, or would you like to finish it up there? Everyone's smiling, so let's keep going. We'll get through all the questions, and then those that can hang on the line can hang on. Fantastic. So we have another question here, which is, my partner has a terminal illness and his prognosis is around 12 months. I've tried having conversations with him about what he might want for the end of his life, but I find it really difficult. How can we have these conversations productively?
I think that one is a big one to focus on values again, and I know I keep coming back to it. It might be that, and there's a lot of evidence around card sorting helping with this kind of thing, because it does focus on values first. If you jump in straight into a conversation like, so, hey, do you want to be resuscitated, or something that can be really confronting, it will be really confronting and people might not want to have the conversation. But if you start the conversation with something that is a bit more, focused on, like, what is it that that is really, really important to you, and what is more important to you than other things, and having those kind of conversations that can be a bit softer and naturally lead into some of the trickier questions. The other thing to keep in mind when it comes to this is, if you're already in a situation where you're quite close to these realities and it can be a bit confronting, it's even more important to remember that the complexity of some of the health information that we're talking about can be another thing that stops people progressing with this. So there's kind of a misconception in advanced care planning that it's just because it's a difficult conversation that people stop talking about it. it's actually in a lot of cases it can be around the complexity of not understanding that the realities that might happen and what some of the healthcare needs that a person might have to consider are and what they are in plain English. So making sure that you really understand that, but also just coming back to it, it might not be a conversation that happens all at once. It might be in drips and drabs, starting off with little bits of the conversation and leading into it, and then eventually you get to the point where you can have the whole conversation. I would say don't give up on it.
Thanks, Rebecca. We have another one here, which is sometimes I feel like I'm excluded from discussions and professionals tell me I'm interfering, but often they don't capture my son's full needs in their assessments, and I'm worried he won't get the formal supports he needs. I'm also worried for the time when I'm not there to help him. Who can I speak to about this?
I think that, you know, as has been said already, sometimes just having a conversation with the public trustee about future planning, about what you can put in place if you're concerned about the future and you not being there for your adult child. But sometimes it's also useful to get some support for yourself to talk about these things and how best to support you to have those conversations with professionals. You know, again, that kind of idea of what do I need to get across effectively to these people when I'm talking to them, so that I get the response and the information I need, and also that they understand that I'm coming at this from, you know, because I care and because I just need to understand what's happening and what I can do. You know, if I need to do anything better or I need to do anything differently, or if, you know, or what are my options and what's open to us. So I think it's just taking time sometimes to think about how am I being heard, and if I'm not getting the responses that I want, maybe I can think about how, you know, how I can engage slightly differently to make sure that people really understand what I want to talk about.
Oh, Michael, you go.
Look, it sounds to me, given the pattern of questions coming in, that maybe quite a few people that are being cared for are subject to NDIS plans. And I think it's important to realise that NDIS is a system in evolution. And I think there is a supported decision-making consultation that they're processing now. And we need to think, I think, more creatively around NDIS funding for supporting the decision-making ability of the NDIS participants and their support system. So I think that this is a state of in flux, and I think we do need to get better at this as a society. But it is a work in progress, and all the organisations here represent private individuals that have to be paid for in one form or another. So how we fund the supported decision-making for that adult disabled child or intellectually disabled child is not something that is completely resolved. And very often for us, it starts as an estate planning conversation within a family, which says, okay, how do we build a care system around this person? And sorry, it just takes money. And for the people that don't have the capital, it is difficult, but I think we can be a lot more creative when it comes to looking at NDIS funding and its approach around building decision-making ability and self-care, and start to try and transition that into support for the family system, not just for the participant. But that's probably a journey of another working life.
I think you make a really good point, Michael, that this is an area of a lot of advocacy ongoing at the moment. And as I said before, in us collectively and us as Carers New South Wales really working on trying to improve supports available in this area, there is a lot happening at the moment in terms of systemic advocacy. And we just did a joint submission recently, our organisations, on this topic. The other thing that I wanted to point out, which I think Maddie's going to post a link for in the chat, is when you are facing situations where your voice is not being heard as a carer, depending on the situation, there are some rights and complaints pathways that you can use. And so that's something that our team can talk to you about. We've done as a separate project. And so Maddie will post the link to there's a series of fact sheets and webinars called Know Your Rights, which we recently published, we actually have a webinar tomorrow on this topic as part of Carers Week as well, from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. So maybe Maddie, if you could also put the registration link for that in the chat, that'd be great. But there's a lot of information in those fact sheets about this, so you may want to have a look at that. And if you're struggling to find that information, you're welcome to contact the policy team, our policy team, for some more information. We have one final question, if people are okay to finish our 10 minutes after. We still have a few on the line, which is great. And you touched on this as well, Michael, but someone has asked, are all these services and supports that are available, are they all cost, or are there free services available? I think it's a really important question, because we know carers often are, in financial hardship. So does anyone want to speak to that?
Our service is free. We offer counselling and mediation and referrals for older people and their families. And, that can be intergenerational. So as we didn't get around to a case study, but we found ourselves sometimes supporting 3 generations of families. So, you might have a separated parent moving in with an older family member. So the family member needs support, but also the separated parent needs support, and sometimes their children need support as well. So we provide all of that, and it's a free service. And we try to, wherever we can, source services that are not only appropriate, but that are within either the costs that people can afford or free. And there are free services out there, and there is advocacy out there. And there's also, and I don't know if it was helpful for the previous question, but we've used often social workers as well. There are not very many community social workers, but there are some, and often they're very useful to support people in terms of advocacy. And we use advocates for older people regularly in our mediations.
And someone's just asked, where you're from, Fiona. So Relationships Australia, New South Wales.
Yeah, and Excitu isn't a free service at this stage. What you can do is use NDIS funds or home care package funds and those kind of things. But there is a one-off fee of $49 to use the online app. But we were always looking for ways that we can partner with people that can help us make it more available to people, so that we can help as many people as possible.
And also, can I just mention, we've got another service, so it's not my service, at Relationships Australia, which is a disability counselling and casework service, and that's also free. So there's a criteria for that, depending on what you need, but it's certainly worth giving us a call if you'd like to talk to them.
And regrettably, the capacity and capability clinic at MQ Health is an outpatient clinic, so it's patient funded. As primarily a law firm that does this work, yes, we are user pays, but increasingly the work that we're doing with NDIS participants is being funded by the NDIS plan, where the plan is plan managed. So, and that's where we're building up that experience of how do we adapt our services into that supported decision-making model that is acceptable to NDIS. But legal services private legal services do cost. We do try and be as cost effective as we can. And we're always happy to talk about exceptional circumstances, and we still do pro bono work.
Thanks, everyone. And I think it's a good way to end in that. I guess the answer to that question would be that there's lots that is available freely, and there's lots that could be funded through packages or aged care packages or plans. There are some things that come at an additional cost, but I think all of us definitely on the line are committed to looking for opportunities to make that as freely available as possible where we can, and to really create resources and information that is freely available to people, because we know that it's really important and not everyone's able to afford private services. And so, as I guess kind of a final recognition as well, all of the professionals with us today, especially those that are in sort of paying services, have just been so great at lending their time to us for this webinar after hours, but also in many of the other activities we've been working on together. So I'd really like to thank all of our panelists today for their interest and commitment in this area to really helping carers to understand some of these tricky issues. So if we were in person, we would give you a clap, but we can't do that online very easily. But thank you again, and we will send a recording of this webinar around along with the information that Maddie put in the chat. So I think we can probably wrap it up there. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, bye-bye.